The church doors had barely closed when Julian Hartwell, Duke of Ravensmore, turned to the woman beside the altar and said the words that would ruin her name before every guest in the room. "I cannot marry you. I will not stand here and pretend this union means anything beyond a debt my father owed." Charlotte Winslow did not gasp. She did not reach for her handkerchief or search the crowd for a friendly face. She stood perfectly still in her plain gray gown, her hands folded in front of her, and let his words settle over the silent church like a slow, cold rain. Behind her, whispers rose from the pews. Feathered hats tilted together. Fans snapped open to hide smirking mouths. Somewhere near the back, a woman gave a small, delighted gasp, the kind reserved for the finest gossip of the season. Julian did not look away from her. He wanted her to see that he meant every word. His father had died only 2 months before, and buried within the old man's will was a single, binding clause. The Ravensmore line would marry Charlotte Winslow, ward of the merchant Alistair Grant, or forfeit control of every property the family held. Julian had assumed, wrongly, that his father had lost his mind in his final days. He had pictured a mousy, forgettable woman, someone easily managed and easily ignored. He had built his fury on that picture for weeks, and now, standing before the real woman, he refused to let go of it. "You have nothing to say?" he asked, his voice carrying further than he intended. Charlotte lifted her chin. Her eyes, a clear and steady brown, met his without flinching. "There is nothing to say to a man who has already decided what I am," she answered quietly. "You did not marry me. You will not have to unmarry me either." She turned before he could respond, and walked down the aisle alone, her steps unhurried, her spine straight as a blade. The murmurs followed her like a current, but she did not quicken her pace. She did not run. She simply left, and the doors of the church swung shut behind her with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Julian remained standing at the altar, aware of every eye in the room now fixed on him instead. He had expected relief. He had expected the satisfaction of a debt refused. Instead, something uncomfortable settled in his chest, a feeling he did not yet have a name for. 3 streets away, in a modest townhouse rented under her guardian's name, Charlotte removed her wedding gown with steady hands and hung it carefully in the wardrobe, as though it were any other garment. Her lady's maid, a quiet young woman named Bridget, hovered nervously by the door, unsure whether to speak. "You are not crying," Bridget finally said. "No," Charlotte replied. "Crying would only prove him right." She sat at the small writing desk by the window and drew out a ledger, one she had kept hidden from everyone but her guardian for the better part of 2 years. Columns of numbers filled the pages in her careful hand: shipping routes, interest rates, the names of banks and merchants across 3 countries. She had not been raised to sit quietly and embroider. Alistair Grant, the merchant who had taken her in after her parents' deaths when she was a girl of 10, had taught her to read a balance sheet before she had learned to dance a proper waltz. He had shown her how fortunes were built, and more importantly, how they collapsed. She had known, long before the wedding, exactly how deep the Ravensmore family's troubles ran. She had known why the old Duke had insisted on this marriage with such desperation. What she had not expected was to be humiliated for it in front of half the nobility of the city. Bridget lit a second candle as the evening grew darker. "What will you do now, miss?" Charlotte studied the numbers in front of her for a long moment before closing the ledger. "Nothing, for now," she said. "Let him believe he has won something." Word of the broken wedding spread through the city faster than any carriage could travel. By the following morning, it was the only topic discussed in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs alike. Some pitied the quiet bride, cast aside so publicly. Others whispered that she must have deserved it, that a woman of no title and uncertain fortune had been foolish to expect any different treatment from a duke. Julian heard none of the pity. He heard only the version that pleased him, the version where he had rightfully refused an unworthy match, and he told himself he had done the sensible thing. He returned to Ravensmore House that evening expecting the matter to be settled and closed. It was not. His steward, a nervous, balding man named Percival Hodge, met him in the study with a stack of unopened letters and a face pale with dread. "Your Grace," Hodge said, his voice trembling slightly, "there is a matter concerning the shipping contracts." Julian waved a hand impatiently. "Later, Hodge." "It cannot wait, Your Grace. The contracts your father signed with Alistair Grant's trading house, they were tied to the marriage. Without the marriage, Mr. Grant's solicitors have already sent notice. The shares are being withdrawn." Julian's irritation faltered. Withdrawn to what effect? Hodge swallowed hard. To the effect, Your Grace, that nearly a third of the estate's income depended on those shipping ventures. Without Mr. Grant's continued investment, several of our creditors will call in their loans within the month. For the first time since the wedding, a small, uneasy doubt crept into Julian's mind. He had assumed his father's will was simply the ramblings of a dying, sentimental man. He had not imagined it might have been a calculated act of survival. "Show me the figures," he said. Across the city, in a townhouse far less grand than Ravensmoor House, Lord Edgar Faircombe read the morning's gossip columns with a satisfaction he did not bother to hide. As the Duke's closest living cousin and next in line should the direct line fail, Edgar had spent years watching Julian inherit everything he himself believed he deserved. He had watched the old Duke favor his son at every turn, had watched Julian grow careless and proud, certain that his position would always protect him. Now, it seemed, fortune was finally turning in Edgar's favor. He had known about the marriage clause in the old Duke's will for months, having quietly bribed a clerk in the family solicitor's office to keep him informed. He had also known, long before the wedding, exactly how precarious the family's finances truly were. What Julian did not yet understand was that Edgar had spent the last several months making certain arrangements of his own, small loans redirected, minor debts quietly purchased, favors called in from men who owed him more than they wished to admit. If the Ravensmoor estate collapsed, Edgar intended to be standing ready to catch whatever remained. The broken wedding was an unexpected gift. He had not needed to lift a finger. Julian's own pride had done the work for him. "Let the fool ruin himself," Edgar murmured to his empty breakfast room, folding the newspaper with a satisfied smile. "I will simply wait." By the end of the week, the full weight of the situation had settled over Ravensmoor House like a fog that refused to lift. Julian sat in his father's old study late into the night, surrounded by ledgers he barely understood, watching numbers that made less and less sense the longer he stared at them. He had never been taught to manage the estate in detail. His father had always intended to teach him slowly, over years, not knowing his own time would run out so quickly. Hodge stood nearby, wringing his hands. "Your Grace, I have written to 3 separate banking houses requesting extensions. 2 have already declined. The third requires a decision within the fortnight, or they will begin proceedings against the estate." Julian rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pressing down on him in a way he had never experienced. "And the shipping shares? Is there truly no way to recover them?" "Only through Mr. Grant, Your Grace, and Mr. Grant, I am told, answers to no one but his ward." Julian looked up sharply. "Miss Winslow?" "Yes, Your Grace." For a long moment, Julian said nothing. He thought of the woman standing so calmly at the altar, unmoved by his cruelty, walking away with a composure that had unsettled him more than any tears could have. He had dismissed her as inconsequential, a burden his father had saddled him with out of some misguided sentiment. It had not occurred to him, not once, that she might hold the very key to the family's survival in her own 2 hands. Pride warred with necessity in his chest. He had humiliated her before the entire city. He had called her worthless in front of witnesses who would repeat his words for years to come. Now he would have to go to her, hat in hand, and beg for the very thing he had thrown away. "Send word," he said finally, his voice low. "I wish to speak with Miss Winslow." Hodge hesitated. "And if she refuses, Your Grace?" Julian stared into the dying fire, the weight of his own foolishness settling heavier with every passing second. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, "I will have earned exactly that." Outside, the city carried on unaware, gossiping over tea about the Duke who had cast aside his quiet bride, never imagining that within days, he would be the one standing at her door, asking for the mercy he had refused to give. Julian arrived at the modest townhouse on Belmont Street just after 9 in the morning, dressed plainly and without his usual retinue of servants trailing behind him. He had chosen to come alone, unwilling to let word spread any faster than it already had. The street was quiet, lined with narrow houses that held none of the grandeur he was accustomed to, and he found himself oddly aware of how out of place his fine carriage looked against the plain brick facades. Bridget answered the door, and upon seeing him, went pale. "Your Grace," she stammered, "I do not believe Miss Winslow is expecting callers." "She is not," Julian admitted, "but I must speak with her regardless. It concerns a matter of some urgency." Bridget hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder, before finally stepping aside to let him in. She led him to a small sitting room where morning light fell across a writing desk cluttered with papers. Charlotte sat there, a pen in hand, and did not immediately look up when he entered. "I did not think you the sort of man to come crawling after humiliating someone in front of half the city," she said evenly, still writing. Julian's jaw tightened, but he swallowed the sharp retort that rose in his throat. He had come to ask for help, not to argue. "I came because circumstances have made it necessary," he said instead. Charlotte finally set down her pen and looked at him properly. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction either, only a calm, measuring patience that made him feel, uncomfortably, as though he were the one being evaluated and found wanting. "Sit down, Your Grace," she said. "Tell me what circumstances you speak of." He remained standing a moment longer out of stubbornness, before finally lowering himself into the chair across from her. "The shipping shares," he began. "Mr. Grant has withdrawn his investment, and with it, a significant portion of the estate's income. My steward tells me the creditors will begin proceedings within a fortnight if the matter is not resolved." "I am aware," Charlotte said simply. Julian frowned. "You knew this would happen." "I knew it the moment you spoke those words in front of the entire congregation," she replied. "The marriage was never simply a sentimental arrangement, Your Grace. My guardian's investment was tied directly to the union. Your father understood this. It seems you did not." The quiet accusation in her voice struck harder than any raised temper could have. Julian felt heat rise in his face, though whether from anger or shame he could not entirely say. "I did not know," he admitted, the words difficult to force out. "I believed my father had lost his sense in his final days. I believed the marriage was nothing more than an old man's sentimental folly. And so you decided to humiliate a stranger in front of witnesses, rather than simply asking questions before your wedding day," Charlotte said. "That was your choice to make, Your Grace. But you must understand that choices carry consequences, even for men who have never had to face them before." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Julian had come prepared to negotiate, to offer terms, to appeal to whatever practical sense she might possess. He had not prepared for the quiet, unshakable dignity with which she met his every word, nor for the growing, uncomfortable realization that every accusation she made was entirely fair. "What would it take," he said finally, "to restore the arrangement your guardian withdrew?" Charlotte studied him for a long moment before answering. "That depends entirely on what you are willing to offer in return. I did not come to this city to be someone's convenient solution, dismissed the moment the crisis passes. If I am to help save your house, Your Grace, I will not do so as a favor quietly reversed and quickly forgotten. I will do so as an equal partner in the matter, with a voice in how it is managed." Julian's pride bristled at the demand, old habits urging him to refuse outright. Yet as he looked at her, steady and unflinching across the small room, he understood that she held every advantage in this conversation, and he held almost none. "Explain what you mean," he said carefully. "I have spent years learning how fortunes are built and how they fall apart," Charlotte said. "My guardian did not raise me to embroider handkerchiefs, Your Grace. He raised me to read ledgers, to understand trade routes, to recognize when a man is lying about the state of his accounts. If your estate is to be saved, it will require more than a signature on a piece of paper. It will require someone who actually understands what is broken and how to fix it." Julian studied her with new eyes, the picture he had built of her in his mind crumbling piece by piece. He had imagined a meek, forgettable woman. Instead, he found himself facing someone sharper and more capable than he had ever expected. Someone who had clearly seen through the family's troubles long before he had even begun to understand them himself. "And if I agree to your terms," he said slowly, "what happens next?" "Then we begin immediately," Charlotte said, rising from her chair and moving to a cabinet where she withdrew a thick folder of papers. "Because, Your Grace, your troubles are considerably worse than a single withdrawn investment. I believe someone within your own household has been quietly making them worse." Julian's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Charlotte laid the folder open on the desk between them, revealing pages of careful notes, dates, and figures that did not match what Hodge had shown him only days before. "I mean," she said, "that certain debts have been purchased by an unnamed party over the last several months, certain loans redirected, certain creditors persuaded to call in payments sooner than they otherwise might have. Someone has been preparing for your family's collapse for quite some time, Your Grace, and I do not believe it was preparation born of concern." Julian stared at the papers, a cold unease settling over him. "Who?" Charlotte met his eyes steadily. "That, Your Grace, is what we will need to discover together." Over the following days, Julian found himself in the unfamiliar position of following Charlotte's lead, rather than issuing commands of his own. She arrived at Ravensmoor House each morning with Bridget as her companion and a satchel of papers under her arm, and set to work in his father's old study as though she had always belonged there. She reviewed contracts line by line, questioned Hodge on details Julian had never thought to ask, and sent a series of carefully worded letters to banking houses that Julian would have sworn were beyond persuasion. He watched her work with a growing sense of astonishment. She spoke to merchants and bankers with the same calm assurance she had shown him at the altar, never raising her voice, never wavering, and somehow managing to extract concessions that Hodge had spent weeks failing to secure. "How did you learn all this?" Julian asked one evening, as she reviewed a stack of shipping contracts by candlelight. "Necessity," Charlotte answered without looking up. "My parents died when I was young, Your Grace. My guardian took me in not out of obligation, but because he saw something useful in me. He taught me because I asked to be taught, and because he believed a mind should never be wasted simply because it belongs to a woman." "You could have told me this before the wedding," Julian said. "You could have corrected whatever mistaken picture my father's letters gave me." Charlotte finally looked up, and for the first time, something sharper than calm patience flickered across her expression. "I did not have the chance, Your Grace," she said. "You decided who I was before you ever spoke a single word to me. You decided it so completely that when you finally did speak, it was only to humiliate me in front of witnesses. I do not think you wished to hear anything I might have said." The words landed with the weight of truth, and Julian found he had no defense against them. He thought back to the church, to the cold satisfaction he had felt in that moment, certain he was righting some great wrong done to him. He had not considered, not once, what it might have cost her to stand there and take his cruelty without breaking. "I was wrong," he said quietly, "about all of it." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the sincerity of the words. "Being wrong is not unforgivable, Your Grace, but it must be followed by better conduct, not simply better words." As the days passed, Julian began to notice small, troubling details in the papers Charlotte had gathered. Several of the redirected debts traced back to accounts managed by his own cousin, Edgar Faircombe. At first he dismissed it as coincidence. Edgar had always been ambitious, always resentful of his position as a mere cousin rather than heir, but Julian had never imagined him capable of anything beyond bitter remarks over dinner. "You suspect him," Charlotte said one afternoon, watching Julian's expression as he studied the documents. "I do not wish to," Julian admitted, "but the pattern is difficult to ignore." "Patterns rarely lie, Your Grace, even when we wish them to." Meanwhile, word had begun to spread through certain circles that Charlotte Winslow, the quietly rejected bride, was now working closely with the very Duke who had humiliated her. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors, Julian would soon learn, could be shaped by hands far more calculating than gossiping tongues alone. Within a week, letters began arriving at the merchant houses Charlotte had approached, letters suggesting that her guardian's finances were not as sound as they appeared, that her advice could not be trusted, that she was manipulating a grieving, guilt-ridden Duke for her own gain. The accusations were vague enough to avoid direct refutation, yet specific enough to plant doubt in cautious men's minds. Charlotte read the first such letter with an expression that betrayed nothing, though Julian noticed the way her hand tightened almost imperceptibly around the page. "Someone does not wish us to succeed," she said quietly. Julian felt a cold certainty settle over him, the same unease he had felt studying the redirected debts. "Edgar," he said. Charlotte set the letter down carefully. "We will need proof, Your Grace. Suspicion alone will not be enough to stop him, and it will certainly not be enough to save your house." Julian looked at her. This woman he had once dismissed as inconsequential, now the only person standing between his family and ruin, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not yet have the courage to name. "Then we will find proof," he said, "together." The letter arrived on a gray morning, delivered by a boy who refused to say who had sent him. Charlotte broke the seal at the breakfast table in Ravensmore House, and within seconds, her expression shifted from calm attention to something colder. "Your Grace," she said, sliding the letter across the table, "I believe we are meant to be frightened." Julian read the words quickly. The letter accused Charlotte, in careful and deniable language, of manufacturing false debts against the estate in order to seize control of Ravensmore's remaining assets for her guardian's trading house. It was signed only with an initial, but the handwriting, elegant and slanted, matched correspondence Julian had seen 100 times before on his cousin's desk. "Edgar," he said again, the name tasting bitter in his mouth. "We suspected as much," Charlotte replied. "Now we must prove it beyond doubt, or these accusations will follow me for the rest of my life, regardless of whether your estate survives." Julian set the letter down, anger tightening in his chest, though this time it was not directed at her. "I will confront him directly." "No," Charlotte said sharply, and something in her tone made him pause. "If you confront him without proof, He will simply deny everything and destroy whatever evidence remains. We must be patient, Your Grace, however difficult that may be." Over the following days, Charlotte worked with a quiet, relentless focus that Julian found himself admiring more with each passing hour. She sent Bridget to speak discreetly with servants in Edgar's household, gathering small, seemingly harmless details. She reviewed old shipping manifests late into the night, cross-referencing dates and figures until patterns began to emerge from what had once looked like chaos. Julian, for his part, began accompanying her on visits to the very banking houses and merchants he had once considered beneath his notice. He watched her negotiate with a precision he had never possessed, watched the way she anticipated objections before they were even spoken, watched the respect that gradually crept into the eyes of men who had initially dismissed her as nothing more than a disgraced young woman trading on a duke's misfortune. "You never once raise your voice," he observed one evening, as their carriage rattled back toward Ravensmoor House after a long meeting with a stubborn banker. "Raising one's voice rarely convinces anyone of anything," Charlotte said. "It only convinces them you have run out of better arguments." Julian found himself smiling, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him that he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit. "My father would have liked you." Charlotte glanced at him, something softening briefly in her expression. "Your father chose me for you, Your Grace, long before either of us had any say in the matter. I like to think he saw something in the arrangement beyond mere convenience." "Julian," he said quietly. She blinked. "Your Grace? My name is Julian. I would like you to use it, if you are willing. I do not think Your Grace quite suits two people working as closely as we have been." A faint smile touched her lips, the first genuine one he had seen from her since the day of the wedding. "Then you may call me Charlotte when we are not in company." The carriage rattled on through the darkening streets, and for the first time since the disaster at the altar, Julian felt something that resembled hope. Go. The breakthrough came nearly 2 weeks later, buried within a stack of old correspondence Charlotte had requested from a clerk at one of the smaller banking houses. Among letters concerning routine loans and minor transactions, she found a name that should never have appeared there at all. A shell account, registered under a false identity, used to quietly purchase 3 separate debts owed by the Ravensmoor estate. "Look here," she said, spreading the papers across the study desk, her finger tracing a line of careful script. "This account was opened 4 months before your father's death. The signature matches a clerk who, according to Bridget's inquiries, was dismissed from Lord Faircomb's household under mysterious circumstances shortly after." Julian leaned over the papers, studying the evidence with growing disbelief. "He has been planning this since before my father died." "It would seem so," Charlotte said grimly. "Your father's will, forcing our marriage, may have been an attempt to protect the estate from exactly this kind of scheme. He may have suspected Edgar long before either of us did." The realization struck Julian with unexpected force. He had spent weeks resenting his father's final decision, viewing it as a sentimental burden forced upon him without explanation. Now, staring at the evidence before him, he began to understand that his father had likely been trying, in the only way he knew how, to save the family from a danger Julian himself had been too blind to see. "We need more," Charlotte said, gathering the papers carefully. "This proves the account exists, but not conclusively that Edgar controls it. We must trace the funds further, and we must do so quietly. If he learns we are close, he will not hesitate to destroy the evidence, or worse." Their investigation deepened over the following days, drawing them into a world of quiet inquiries and careful discretion. Charlotte proved remarkably skilled at navigating this hidden landscape, drawing on connections her guardian had cultivated over decades of trade dealings. She met with clerks in dim taverns, exchanged careful letters with contacts in port cities, and pieced together a picture of Edgar's scheme with the patience of someone who had clearly done this kind of work before. Julian, meanwhile, found himself drawn deeper into Charlotte's confidence, not merely as a partner in crisis, but as someone he genuinely wished to understand. He asked about her childhood, about the parents she had lost too young, about the guardian who had shaped her into the formidable woman she had become. She answered carefully at first, guarded by old habits of caution, but slowly, as the days passed, she began to speak more freely. "I did not choose to be raised the way I was," she admitted one evening, as they reviewed papers together by the fire. "There were times I resented it, watching other girls learn dancing and needlework while I studied trade routes and interest rates. But my guardian always told me that a mind trained to understand the world would never be at the mercy of those who wished to deceive it." "He was right," Julian said. "Without your mind, my house would already have fallen." Charlotte studied him for a long moment. "You give me too much credit, Julian. None of this would matter if you had not been willing to change, to listen, to work rather than simply command." I had a difficult teacher, he said, a faint smile touching his mouth. You had a patient one, Charlotte corrected, though her own smile betrayed her. The warmth between them grew slowly, built not on grand declarations, but on quiet moments of shared purpose, late nights spent poring over papers, small victories celebrated with nothing more than a satisfied glance across a crowded desk. Julian found himself looking forward to her arrival each morning, found himself lingering in conversations long after the day's business had concluded, found himself, to his own quiet astonishment, beginning to care for the woman he had once so carelessly wronged. Not everyone in the city shared Julian's growing regard for Charlotte. As their investigation progressed and rumors of their partnership spread, whispers grew louder among certain circles that the Duke had been thoroughly ensnared by a clever, calculating woman intent on securing his fortune through manipulation rather than merit. Edgar, watching from the shadows of his own quiet scheming, began to grow uneasy as his carefully laid plans failed to produce the collapse he had anticipated. He had expected Julian's pride and inexperience to doom the estate within weeks. Instead, the very woman he had hoped would remain a humiliated footnote to the scandal had somehow become the family's greatest asset. He decided, with the cold calculation that had guided every move since his cousin's father first fell ill, that it was time to change his approach. The next attack came not through vague, deniable letters, but through a direct and public accusation delivered at a gathering Julian could not avoid, a formal dinner hosted by one of the city's oldest banking families, attended by nearly every creditor whose goodwill the Ravensmore estate desperately needed. Edgar arrived unannounced partway through the evening, his expression carefully arranged into one of grave concern. He approached the host with practiced ease, speaking just loudly enough to be overheard by the surrounding guests. "I feel it my duty," he said, his voice carrying the false reluctance of a man burdened by unpleasant knowledge, "to warn you all that certain documents circulating regarding the Ravensmore accounts may not be entirely honest. I have reason to believe my cousin has been advised by a woman with a personal interest in inflating the estate's troubles, the better to secure her guardian's position within it." The room fell into an uneasy hush. Julian, standing across the hall with Charlotte at his side, felt every eye turned toward them, the same cold weight of public judgment he had once inflicted upon her now settling instead upon them both. Charlotte's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her side, but her expression remained composed, betraying nothing of the fury Julian suspected simmered beneath her calm exterior. "He grows desperate," she murmured quietly, for Julian's ears alone. "A confident man does not need to attack in public. He attacks when he fears he is losing." Julian stepped forward before Edgar could continue, his voice steady and clear enough to carry across the silent room. "My cousin speaks with great confidence for a man who has never once shown me a single document to support his claims," Julian said. "Perhaps, Edgar, you might explain instead why a shell account bearing your former clerk's signature has spent the past 4 months purchasing debts against my own estate." The color drained from Edgar's face, if only for a moment before he composed himself. "I have no notion what you mean." "We will see," Julian said, "whether the rest of this room shares your uncertainty once the full accounting is made public." The exchange left the gathered guests murmuring with fresh interest, no longer certain which cousin deserved their suspicion, but Julian could see, in the brief flash of panic across Edgar's face, that the accusation had struck exactly where intended. Edgar was no longer merely scheming from the shadows. He was afraid. Later that night, as their carriage carried them home through quiet streets, Charlotte sat in thoughtful silence, watching the darkened city pass beyond the window. "He will not simply retreat now," she said finally. "A cornered man becomes dangerous, Julian. We must be prepared for whatever he attempts next." "I know," Julian said. "But tonight, for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes instead of confidence. We are closer than he expected us to be." Charlotte turned to him, her expression softer than the composed mask she wore before company. "We are closer because of the work we have done together. I could not have uncovered any of this alone, Julian, not without access to your household, your accounts, your name. And I could not have survived any of it without you," he replied quietly. "I think you knew that from the very beginning, long before I did." She said nothing, but the small, private smile that crossed her face in the dim carriage light told him everything he needed to know. Edgar Faircombe did not sleep the night of the dinner party. He sat alone in his study long after his servants had retired, staring at the fire until it burned down to embers, turning over every possible way his careful scheme might unravel. He had spent months building the shell account, months redirecting debts and courting disgruntled clerks willing to look the other way for the right price. He had believed himself untouchable, protected by layers of false names and careful deniability. Now, in the space of a single evening, his own cousin had spoken his secret aloud, before half the city's most influential creditors. By morning, he had made his decision. If he could not destroy the Ravensmore estate through quiet financial ruin, he would destroy Charlotte Winslow's reputation instead, and in doing so, cripple the partnership that had become his greatest obstacle. The forged documents appeared within days, delivered anonymously to 3 separate banking houses that Charlotte had painstakingly courted over the previous weeks. They bore her guardian's seal, expertly copied, and detailed a scheme in which Charlotte herself had allegedly falsified estate records in order to inflate debts owed to her guardian's trading house, all while positioning herself to marry into the Ravensmore title once the manufactured crisis had run its course. The documents were clever, Julian had to admit, studying them with growing horror in the study at Ravensmore House. They incorporated real figures, real dates, even real correspondence, twisted just enough to suggest deception where none existed. To any banker unfamiliar with the true accounts, the forgery would appear entirely convincing. "He has moved faster than I expected," Charlotte said, her composure fraying for the first time since Julian had known her. She held one of the forged letters with hands that trembled slightly, though her voice remained steady. "If these documents are believed, my guardian's entire trading house could be ruined. My name would be worthless in any respectable circle for the rest of my life." Julian watched her carefully, seeing beneath the calm exterior to the fear she rarely allowed herself to show. He crossed the room and took the letter gently from her hands. "Then we will prove them false," he said, "together, exactly as we have done everything else." "It is not so simple, Julian," Charlotte said, a rare edge of desperation creeping into her voice. "Forgeries this careful are difficult to disprove quickly. By the time we gather sufficient evidence, the damage to my reputation and my guardian's business may already be done." Word of the accusations spread through the city with alarming speed, carried by the same eager tongues that had once gossiped over Julian's public rejection of his bride. This time, the whispers turned against Charlotte, painting her as a calculating woman who had orchestrated her own humiliation as the opening move in an elaborate scheme to seize control of a noble fortune. Bridget arrived at the townhouse one afternoon in tears, having overheard 2 matrons discussing Charlotte's supposed deceptions with malicious relish outside a milliner's shop. Charlotte listened to the account with a stillness that worried Julian more than any outburst could have. "I have spent my entire life building a reputation for honesty," Charlotte said quietly, once Bridget had been sent to compose herself. "My guardian's entire business depends on the trust of men who have no reason to trust a woman managing trade accounts in the first place. If this forgery stands unchallenged, everything he built, everything I have worked toward, will be gone within a matter of weeks." Julian felt a fierce, protective anger rising in his chest, sharper than anything he had experienced even during the worst of the estate's troubles. "Then we move faster than Edgar expects. We do not wait for careful proof alone. We force him into the open." Charlotte looked up at him, something wary in her expression. "What do you propose?" "A trap," Julian said. "If Edgar believes his forgery has succeeded, he will grow careless. We allow him to believe the documents are working, and in doing so, we draw him close enough to expose the very account that funded this scheme from the beginning." The plan took shape over the following days, built from Charlotte's meticulous understanding of financial records and Julian's growing confidence in navigating the world she had spent years mastering. They quietly informed a single, carefully chosen banker of their suspicions, a man known for his discretion and his long friendship with Julian's late father, and asked him to appear convinced by Edgar's forged documents, while secretly cooperating with their investigation. The banker, a steady and thoughtful man named Percival Ashcombe, agreed without hesitation once he understood the full scope of Edgar's deception. "Your father trusted very few men in his final years," Ashcombe told Julian, as they finalized the arrangement in his private office. "I am glad to see his trust in Miss Winslow's guidance was not misplaced." With Ashcombe's cooperation secured, Charlotte drafted a series of careful letters, designed to suggest that the family's finances were crumbling faster than anticipated, that a final, desperate concession might soon be extracted from the Ravensmore estate. The letters were meant to reach Edgar through the same clerk he had once corrupted, now secretly working under Bridget's careful watch. "If he believes we are truly desperate," Charlotte explained, "he will act to secure his advantage quickly, and in doing so, reveal the final connections we need." The bait worked precisely as Charlotte had predicted. Within a week, Edgar arranged a private meeting with Ashcombe, believing he had found a banker eager to negotiate favorable terms for taking control of the crumbling Ravensmore accounts. What he did not know was that Charlotte and Julian sat concealed in an adjoining room, listening to every word through a door left deliberately ajar. The Duke's finances are beyond saving, Edgar told Ashcombe with the confident ease of a man who believed himself entirely unobserved. Once the forged documents against Miss Winslow are fully accepted, her guardian's trading house will collapse, and with it, any remaining hope of restoring the estate's shipping income. I am prepared to offer generous terms for whatever assets remain, once the title passes to me. You seem remarkably certain the title will pass to you at all, Ashcombe said carefully. It is only a matter of time, Edgar replied. My cousin is a fool led about by a scheming woman. Once she is disgraced, and the estate finally falls, there will be no one left to stand in my way. Behind the door, Julian felt Charlotte's hand find his in the darkness, her grip firm despite the tension radiating through her. He squeezed her fingers gently, a silent promise that the moment of reckoning was finally within reach. Ashcombe, following the plan exactly as they had rehearsed, pressed further. And the shell account funding these debt purchases? I assume it remains secure? Edgar, growing overconfident in the private comfort of what he believed to be a sympathetic ear, made the mistake that would ultimately undo him. Entirely secure, he said, and then, in a moment of careless pride, named the exact account and the clerk who had helped him establish it, along with the dates of every transaction he had orchestrated over the past several months. It was more than enough. Julian stepped through the door the moment Edgar finished speaking, Charlotte close behind him, her expression calm despite the fury Julian knew burned beneath it. Edgar's face drained of all color as he realized the trap that had closed around him. Julian, this is not what it— Save your excuses for the magistrates, Julian said, his voice cold with a fury he had rarely allowed himself to show. I believe you have just confessed to everything we needed, in front of a witness respected throughout the city. Ashcombe nodded gravely. I heard every word, Lord Faircombe. I will not soon forget it. Edgar's composure shattered entirely, his carefully cultivated confidence collapsing into desperate bargaining. Julian, please. We are family. Surely there is some arrangement. You forged documents intended to destroy an innocent woman's reputation, Julian said, stepping closer, his voice low and unforgiving. You conspired to bankrupt my family for your own gain, beginning before my own father had even died. There will be no arrangement, Edgar. There will only be consequences. Charlotte stood quietly beside Julian as Edgar was escorted from the building, her earlier fear giving way to something steadier, something that looked almost like relief. When the room finally emptied, she turned to Julian, her composed mask slipping just enough to reveal the exhaustion and gratitude beneath it. We did it, she said softly, as though she could hardly believe it herself. You did it, Julian corrected gently. I simply had the good sense to listen when you told me what needed to be done. Charlotte allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first true relief she had shown since the forged documents first appeared. There is still work ahead of us, Julian. Evidence to formally present, reputations to fully restore. This is not yet finished. No, Julian agreed, reaching for her hand once more, unwilling to let go of the closeness they had built through every difficult hour of the past weeks. But for the first time since my father's death, I believe we will see it through to the end, together. Outside, the city carried on unaware that the balance of power within one of its oldest noble houses had just shifted entirely, and that the quiet bride once publicly rejected at the altar had, in the end, proven herself the very foundation upon which that house would be rebuilt. News of Edgar Faircomb's confession spread through the city within a single day, though not in the manner Julian and Charlotte had hoped. Edgar, given a single night in a private room under guard while formal charges were prepared, used the hours to send a flurry of desperate letters to allies he believed still owed him loyalty. By morning, a new rumor had begun circulating through certain drawing rooms, one far more dangerous than the earlier accusations against Charlotte. The rumor claimed that Julian himself had orchestrated the entire confrontation as a means of removing a rival heir through false accusation, and that Charlotte Winslow, far from an innocent victim, had helped stage the entire confession using carefully rehearsed words designed to entrap an honest man. He is clever, even cornered, Charlotte said grimly, reading the latest whispers relayed to her by a worried Bridget. He cannot save himself through evidence any longer, so he attempts to save himself through doubt instead. Julian paced the length of his father's study, frustration evident in every movement. The magistrates will not act on rumor alone. We have Ashcombe's testimony, the account records, the forged documents themselves. Surely that is enough. It should be, Charlotte said carefully. But you forget, Julian, that Edgar is still your cousin, still a man of standing within this city, however diminished. There will be those eager to believe any story that spares them the discomfort of choosing between two members of the same noble house. Who? The formal proceedings, when they finally began, proved far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Edgar's solicitor, a sharp and unscrupulous man well versed in courtroom maneuvering, argued that the confession overheard through a partially open door could not be considered reliable testimony, that the shell account bearing Edgar's clerk's signature could easily have been established by someone else entirely wishing to implicate him, and that the forged documents against Charlotte might, in fact, have originated from Charlotte's own hand, an elaborate scheme to secure sympathy and financial advantage. Julian sat through the hearing with mounting fury, watching as every carefully gathered piece of evidence was twisted and questioned by a man skilled in exactly this sort of deception. Charlotte, seated beside him, remained outwardly composed, though he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the careful stillness of her hands folded in her lap. "We need more than testimony," she murmured to him during a brief recess, her voice low enough to avoid being overheard. "We need something undeniable, something that cannot be argued away by clever words." "What do you suggest?" Julian asked. Charlotte's expression sharpened with sudden purpose. "The clerk, Edgar's former clerk, the one who helped establish the account and was dismissed shortly afterward. If we can find him, and if he is willing to testify against the man who used and then discarded him, his word combined with the physical records will be far harder to dismiss than mere overheard conversation." The search for the missing clerk consumed the following days, drawing Julian and Charlotte into corners of the city neither had previously ventured. Bridget's earlier inquiries among Edgar's former household staff finally bore fruit, leading them to a small, run-down lodging house near the docks, where the dismissed clerk, a nervous young man named Oliver Pratt, had been living in near poverty since losing his position months earlier. Oliver proved understandably reluctant to speak at first, fear evident in every guarded answer he gave. He had, after all, participated willingly in Edgar's scheme, however much he had come to regret it since. "He promised me a position in his household once he inherited," Oliver admitted finally, sitting hunched in the dim light of his small room, twisting his hands nervously in his lap. "When the accounts grew too complicated, when I began asking questions he did not wish to answer, he dismissed me without a reference and without a single coin owed for my final weeks of service. I have not been able to find honest work since." Charlotte's expression softened with genuine sympathy, a quality Julian had come to recognize as entirely sincere rather than merely calculated for effect. "Mr. Pratt, we do not wish to see you punished for actions taken under a man who clearly cared nothing for your welfare beyond his own convenience. But we do need the truth, spoken plainly, before the magistrates." Oliver hesitated a long moment before finally nodding, something like relief crossing his tired features. "I will tell them everything I know. I have carried this weight long enough. I would rather see justice done than continue protecting a man who never once considered protecting me." With Oliver's testimony secured, along with additional documentation Charlotte managed to obtain from a sympathetic contact within the shipping registry offices, the case against Edgar grew considerably stronger. Yet even as the evidence mounted, Edgar's solicitor continued his efforts to sow doubt, suggesting now that Oliver Pratt's testimony had been purchased, that a poor, desperate young man might say anything for the promise of financial relief. The accusation, though baseless, found some sympathetic ears among those still unwilling to fully condemn a man of noble birth on the word of servants and a disgraced bride. Julian felt his patience wearing thin with each passing day of delay, each fresh rumor that seemed to spring up faster than they could be dismissed. It was Charlotte, once again, who proposed the solution that would finally bring the matter to its conclusion. "We have gathered evidence, testimony, and confession," she said, one evening as they reviewed their case by candlelight in the study that had, over the preceding weeks, become something like a shared refuge for them both. "What we have not yet done is present it all together, publicly, before the very people whose whispers have shaped this entire ordeal. Let them see everything at once, undeniable and complete, rather than piecemeal fragments easily dismissed one by one." "A public reckoning," Julian said slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "Precisely," Charlotte replied. "The same society that watched you humiliate me at the altar deserves to witness the truth in equal measure. Let there be no room left for doubt, no shadow of rumor Edgar might yet hide within." Plans for the gathering took shape over the following week, disguised as a formal dinner hosted by Julian to mark the restoration of the Ravensmoor estate's financial standing, an event to which every creditor, every gossiping matron, and every doubtful lord who had whispered against Charlotte would be formally invited. Edgar himself, still awaiting the conclusion of formal proceedings, would be present as well, unable to refuse an invitation from the very cousin whose downfall he had once so confidently anticipated. In the days leading up to the gathering, Charlotte worked tirelessly to organize every piece of evidence into a clear, undeniable presentation, while Julian focused on securing the cooperation of key witnesses, including Ashcombe and, cautiously, young Oliver Pratt, who agreed to attend despite his evident nerves at facing the man who had once controlled his fate so completely. On the eve of the gathering, Julian found Charlotte alone in the study, reviewing her notes one final time by the light of a single candle. He watched her for a long moment from the doorway before finally speaking. "You have carried the weight of proving your own innocence for weeks now," he said quietly, "when it was never yours to prove in the first place. I am the one who wronged you first, Charlotte. I am the one who should have been fighting for your name from the very beginning." Charlotte looked up, something tender flickering across her tired features. "You have fought for it, Julian, every day since that first difficult conversation in my sitting room. I do not think either of us could have reached this moment alone." Julian crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands gently in his own. "Tomorrow, when the truth is finally laid bare before everyone who once doubted you, I intend to make certain the entire city understands exactly what I have come to understand myself, that you are not merely the woman who saved my family's fortune, but the finest, bravest person I have ever had the privilege to know." Charlotte's breath caught softly, her earlier exhaustion giving way to something warmer, something neither of them had dared to name outright, until this quiet, candlelit moment. "Then let us finish what we started," she said softly. "Together, exactly as we always have." Outside, the city slept on, unaware that tomorrow evening would bring an end to months of scheming, doubt, and quiet cruelty, and the beginning of a truth far more remarkable than any rumor that had come before it. The grand hall of Ravensmoor House had not seen a gathering of such size since Julian's father's final birthday celebration, years before illness had claimed him. Candlelight blazed from every chandelier, and the same nobility who had once crowded into a church to witness a bride's public humiliation now filled this room instead, drawn by curiosity, obligation, and the promise of witnessing whatever remained of the scandal that had consumed the city's gossip for weeks. Charlotte stood at Julian's side as guests arrived, dressed not in the plain gray gown she had worn to her own wedding, but in a deep blue silk that Julian had quietly commissioned for her, a color chosen deliberately to stand in contrast to the meekness he had once so wrongly assumed defined her. She wore it with the same quiet composure she wore everything else, though Julian could feel the tension in her posture as Edgar entered the hall, flanked by his solicitor, his expression carefully arranged into wounded dignity. "He still believes he might yet talk his way free," Charlotte murmured. "He will not have the chance," Julian replied. Dinner proceeded with careful, deliberate normalcy, conversation flowing around the hall as though the evening were nothing more than an ordinary celebration of restored fortune. Julian watched the room with patient attention, waiting for the precise moment Charlotte had suggested, the moment when curiosity and impatience among the guests would have grown strong enough to welcome, rather than resist, the revelations about to unfold. When the final course had been cleared and idle conversation began to quiet into expectant murmurs, Julian rose from his seat at the head of the long table, and the hall fell gradually silent. "I owe this gathering an explanation," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Many of you witnessed, some months ago, a wedding that ended not in celebration, but in cruelty. I stood before this very city and rejected a woman I believed unworthy of my family's name, based on assumptions I never troubled myself to question." A ripple of uneasy murmurs passed through the guests. Edgar, seated near the far end of the table, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the direction of the speech but unable, in so public a setting, to interrupt it. "I was wrong," Julian continued, his eyes finding Charlotte's across the room. "Wrong about her character, wrong about her worth, and most dangerously, wrong about the true source of my family's troubles. While I indulged my pride, believing myself the wronged party in a match I had never wanted, another member of my own family was quietly working to destroy everything my father spent his life building." The murmurs sharpened into something closer to gasps. Julian gestured, and Hodge, standing near the doorway, brought forward a bound collection of documents, which Julian laid deliberately upon the table before the assembled guests. "These records," Julian said, "detail a shell account established 4 months before my father's death, used to purchase debts against this estate under false identities, deliberately hastening a collapse that would leave my cousin, Lord Edgar Faircombe, poised to inherit a title stripped of everything that once made it worth holding." Edgar rose sharply from his seat, his composure finally cracking. "This is slander, Julian. Nothing more than desperate accusations meant to distract from your own. Sit down, Edgar, Julian said, his voice cold and unwavering. Or allow the evidence to speak for itself, and let this room decide whose word deserves more weight. Charlotte rose then, moving with quiet authority to stand beside Julian, and the room's attention shifted fully toward her, the very woman whose reputation Edgar had so recently attempted to destroy through careful forgery. Several weeks ago, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye upon her, documents began circulating, suggesting I had falsified estate records for personal gain. I would like this gathering to hear, directly, from the man who helped create those forgeries under duress, and who has since chosen honesty over continued silence. Oliver Pratt stepped forward from where he had been waiting near the edge of the hall, visibly nervous beneath the weight of so many noble eyes, yet resolute nonetheless. In a clear, if trembling voice, he recounted the months he had spent under Edgar's direction, establishing the shell account, redirecting debts, and finally, forging the documents meant to destroy Charlotte's reputation, once his usefulness to the scheme had otherwise been exhausted. Ashcombe followed, offering his own steady testimony regarding the private meeting in which Edgar had, believing himself unobserved, confessed openly to every detail of his scheme. By the time the final piece of evidence had been laid before the assembled guests, the mood within the hall had shifted entirely. Sympathetic glances that had once been directed toward the wronged and scheming Duke now turned instead toward his cousin, whose face had grown pale and desperate beneath the weight of undeniable proof. "You have no right," Edgar said, his voice cracking under the strain of collapsing composure. "No right to parade my private affairs before." "You forfeited any claim to privacy," Julian said, "the moment you chose to forge documents intended to destroy an innocent woman's name, in service of a scheme that began before my own father was even laid to rest." The magistrates present among the guests, having witnessed the evidence presented so thoroughly and publicly, required little further persuasion to proceed with the formal charges already prepared against Edgar. He was escorted from the hall under guard, his protests growing quieter with each step, until the great doors of Ravensmore House closed behind him, marking the true end of the scheme that had threatened to destroy an entire noble house. In the hushed aftermath, as the assembled guests began to process the full scope of what they had witnessed, Julian turned to face the room once more, Charlotte standing steady beside him. "I owe this gathering one final admission," he said, his voice softening from the formal authority of moments before into something far more personal. "Months ago, I stood before many of you and called this woman unworthy, based on nothing more than careless assumption and wounded pride. Tonight, I stand before you instead to say that Charlotte Winslow alone saved this house, not through the marriage my father demanded, but through her own intelligence, integrity, and unwavering strength, qualities I was too foolish to recognize until I very nearly lost the chance to know them at all." He turned fully to face her now, taking her hand gently in his before the entire gathered assembly, his earlier formality giving way to quiet, unguarded sincerity. "I do not ask for your hand again out of obligation, or debt, or my father's demands," he said. "I ask because I have come to know you these past months as the most remarkable person I have ever had the privilege to stand beside, and because I cannot imagine facing whatever comes next in my life without you at my side." Charlotte's composed expression finally softened entirely, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, though this time they were not born of humiliation or fear, but of a happiness she had not allowed herself to fully believe possible until this very moment. "You once rejected me before this same room," she said softly, "and I walked away with nothing but my own dignity to carry me forward. Tonight, you offer me something far more valuable than dignity alone, Julian. You offer me a partnership built not on obligation, but on genuine respect and choice." "Then choose it," Julian said quietly, "as I have chosen you, fully and without hesitation." Charlotte's answer came not in careful, measured words, but in the simple, radiant smile that broke across her features, the first truly unguarded expression Julian had ever witnessed from her. "Yes," she said, her voice clear enough to carry through the silent hall. "Yes, Julian, I will." The gathered guests, who had arrived that evening expecting nothing more than confirmation of a lingering scandal, instead witnessed its complete and unexpected transformation into something far more hopeful, applause and murmurs of genuine approval, finally replacing the cold judgment that had once filled this very house. Charlotte Winslow, once publicly rejected before all of noble society, stood now not as a footnote to another family's misfortune, but as the very foundation upon which an entire noble house had been rebuilt, restored not by wealth or title alone, but by intelligence, courage, and a quiet strength that had, in the end, proven more powerful than pride itself. A year had passed since the night the truth finally came out before the assembled nobility of the city, and Ravensmoor House looked nothing like the cold, uncertain place it had been in those anxious early months. The grounds, once neglected during years of quiet financial strain, now bloomed with carefully tended gardens. The shipping ventures that had nearly collapsed under Edgar's scheming now thrived under Charlotte's steady management, expanded further than even her guardian had once dared imagine, bringing steady prosperity back to a house that had teetered so close to ruin. Edgar Faircombe had been formally stripped of any claim to the family's holdings, his fraud proven beyond any lingering doubt before the full weight of the courts. He had left the city quietly, his once proud name reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among cautious mothers warning ambitious younger sons against the dangers of unchecked greed. Julian rarely thought of him at all these days, the bitterness of betrayal having long since faded beneath the weight of a happiness he had once believed entirely beyond his reach. Charlotte moved through the halls of Ravensmoor House now not as a rejected bride enduring an unwanted arrangement, but as its true and equal mistress, her sharp mind and steady judgment respected by every merchant, banker, and servant who had once doubted her. She had continued her work long after the wedding that finally, properly united them, refusing to set aside the skills that had saved the family in its darkest hour, simply because the crisis had passed. On a quiet afternoon in early autumn, Julian found her in the study that had once been his father's, now transformed into a space entirely her own, filled with ledgers and correspondence from trading partners across 3 countries. She looked up as he entered, the same steady warmth in her eyes that had grown between them over the long months of shared struggle and quiet trust. "You look pleased with yourself," she observed, setting down her pen. "I received a letter this morning," Julian said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "from a young banker who once doubted whether a woman could truly manage a noble estate's finances. He wishes now to know whether you might consider advising his own family's struggling ventures." Charlotte's lips curved into a faint, satisfied smile. It seems reputation, once properly earned, travels rather further than idle rumor ever did. "It seems so," Julian agreed, reaching across the desk to take her hand, a gesture that had long since become second nature between them. "Though I confess, I am rather selfishly reluctant to share your talents with every struggling estate in the city." "You need not worry," Charlotte said, lacing her fingers through his. "This house, and the family within it, will always come first." Bridget appeared in the doorway then, no longer the nervous young maid who had once trembled at the sight of a duke arriving unannounced, but a confident young woman who had grown alongside her mistress through every difficult turn of the past year. "Your Grace, Lady Ravensmoor," she said, unable to fully suppress her fond smile at the familiar sight of the couple together. "The guests for this evening's dinner have begun to arrive." Julian rose, offering his hand to Charlotte as she gathered her papers with practiced efficiency. "Shall we, my lady?" Charlotte took his hand, the same steady, unshaken composure she had carried since the very first day he had wronged her, now softened by genuine, unguarded happiness. "Together, Julian, as we have faced everything else." They walked from the study side by side, out into the grand hall where warm candlelight and the sound of gathering guests awaited them. A house once nearly lost to ruin, now thriving under the partnership of 2 people who had learned, through hardship and honesty alike, that true strength was never found in pride or title, but in the courage to be honest, to listen, and to choose, again and again, the harder and better path forward. Outside, the autumn evening settled gently over the city, carrying no trace of the scandal that had once consumed every whispered conversation within its walls. In its place remained only the quiet, well-earned legacy of a duke who had learned humility, and a woman once cruelly cast aside, who had ultimately proven herself the very heart of the noble house she alone had saved.